Hey, Mike Zorns, also known as the Political Otter, coming to you from the Liberty Village in Toronto. And I have to admit, I haven't filmed here in a long time and had forgotten how challenging it is because there's so much ambient sound around. So I am going to apologize if you don't like the sound quality on this particular video. First of all, let me thank you everyone for the engagement online, especially those of you who see the world through a different lens than I do and disagree. There are some fantastic arguments being put forward, so please like, subscribe, continue to comment in the chats. I will reply to you as I'm able to. I am really enjoying some of the debate and discussion that is starting to go on in the channel here. It is a Saturday, which is why you see me dressed like this instead of my usual corporate attire. And I'm thinking of doing a new series, and I want to get your opinions on this. If there are topics within it that you would want me to cover, a lot of things that I'm really passionate about are demographics, world demographics, Canadian demographics. They play a huge impact in what's happening in the world, regardless of who's responsible for policy. How we deal with those demographic changes is that fun little thing we call politics. So I love being able to do deeper dives into those for you. I'm also a huge history geek, if you hadn't noticed. And I think it's so important to understanding where we are today to understand a lot of the path of what got us here. When you see history through its long, long lens, I have to admit, you just get a little more optimistic about what's going on in the world, a little less cynical about where we are, and a little more bright-eyed about what the potential of tomorrow can bring. So, if there's any Canadian history topics that you'd like me to do a deep dive on, if there's anything around our demographics and how it impacts some of the economic shifts we're seeing right now, as we are living through a generational change, let me know in the comments and I will definitely do those videos. All right, today, on that note, there's three significant events in Canadian history that I personally believe have shaped who we are as a Canadian society, more than almost any others. So I'm going to very quickly touch on what those three are and why they're so significant to our identity. First and foremost, the U.S. Revolution. So, the Declaration of Independence, as much as it is the founding document of the United States, is also kind of the founding document of Canada. If we remember back to the history of the time, there were 13 colonies all along the eastern seaboard that made up that were all British colonies. They decided to break away from British rule, no longer be part of the empire, fought a decent war around it, and won their independence. These 13 colonies then went and formed the United States of America. The North American history landscape really immediately changes and takes off from there. But this had a really interesting impact because there were a lot more British colonies than that. Upper Canada, which is today Ontario, and at the time Lower Canada, which is now Quebec, were both part of the British Empire at this time, as were a couple of the Canadian maritime provinces. So what happened when the U.S. Revolution ended and they won their independence, there were a lot of people living within those 13 colonies who were still really loyal to the crown. They just weren't welcome anymore. So they all came north and really settled a lot of what is today southern Ontario. The whole corridor from Ottawa all the way across the northern part of the Great Lakes region to the Windsor-Detroit border is disproportionately settled in at that time frame by these British subjects who did not want to be part of the US after it won its independence. They wanted to stay loyal to the crown and to Great Britain, so they all came across the lakes and settled that region of Canada. This has forever had a huge impact on what the identity of Ontario in particular looks like, but it's also really played into a different psychology of who Canadians are compared to Americans. What we've really seen with the US is you have this very rugged individualist mindset. One of their great heroes is the Western cowboy with the peacemaker on his hip, riding solo through the Great Plains. Our equivalent in Canada is Dudley Do, right? So this kind of loyalty to the crown, this British mind, this sort of British colonial mindset, is something that does still very strongly underpin the culture of Canada. And it's one of the things that fundamentally differentiates us in our identity, how we think, how we interact in the world from what the US is. So I think it's one of the most important events in Canadian history is actually the American Revolution. Okay, number two, I think something that fundamentally changed Canada's relationship with the rest of the world is 1988 when we re-elect Brian Mulroney. And the reason I say that is because this election in particular was really a referendum. Wow, I'm gonna need one more coffee. Talking weird this morning. Was a referendum on free trade with the US. Canada had disproportionately had a lot of preferential trade agreements with the UK prior to this. Ever since World War II, we had really been, every time the US needed an ally on something globally, any conflict that it was involved in, anytime that it wanted to increase security against the Soviet Union, Canada was kind of there going, "Hey, buddy, we're happy to help. You know what? We're first in line to throw people, money, resources at this. Hey, by the way, while we're doing that, can we get a couple of favorable deals around aluminum, around softwood lumber, around Alberta oil, around." All of this really culminated into the first original NAFTA agreement. Why this is so important, aside from bringing us closer economically to the US, which has had a 35-year impact, and also bringing us culturally closer to the US, is the debate between Mulroney and John, who was a conservative prime minister at the time who won re-election, and John Turner, who was the head of the Liberal Party at the time, and actually delivered like the largest loss in the entirety of the history of the Liberal Party. Is a really relevant debate because we're having the same one today, a generation later, which was, is the future of Canada going to be an increase in north-south trade? Or is it going to be a Canada first mentality with an increase in east-west trade? Both men had very, very different visions around what they wanted for that. Both felt that the impact of a free trade agreement would fundamentally change the makeup of the country. Mulroney was very much arguing that this was going to be something that was going to give Canada a stronger presence and stage globally, was going to allow our economy to grow and change and build in ways that it would never be able to under any other circumstance. He was right on all of the above. Turner was arguing that this was going to dilute our identity in a way that nothing else in our history ever had. He also he argued that we would become so dependent on the U.S. that Canada would effectively almost become a 51st state and a colony of the U.S. Don't know if we went that far, but kind of interesting that he was calling that out in 1988. So I think that election and then the subsequent NAFTA agreement, US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which Mexico then got brought into a couple years later under NAFTA, is one of the historically most significant moments in Canadian history because it changed the economics of the country, but it also changed how goods and services flowed within the country, which has had a significant impact on our culture. Let's remember, we are a confederation. Our provinces are more independent to the federal government than any U.S. state is to their federal government. And every province in Canada does more north-south trade with the U.S. and is more dependent on the U.S. for its GDP than it is with any internal trade within the country. So, good, bad, otherwise, not going to make the judgment calls on whether they got that right or wrong in 1988, but I think it is the single most important election in modern Canadian history to understand where we are today. Okay, third one, and I'm going to make this really short because we're already at like 11 and a half minutes, is the repatriation of the Canadian Constitution. This, from a cultural perspective, also started to shift us closer to the US than anything that we'd ever seen before. This was Canada making a statement that not a lot within the British Commonwealth have done, where we really reclaimed such a higher level of independence and autonomy and control for our own destiny, but we still stayed close to Britain and still continue to be effectively part of the British Commonwealth. There's definitely other countries who have done this, but in a lot of those cases we've seen them separate from the Commonwealth. There's definitely a few exceptions when you start to look at the New Zealand and Australian experience, but Canada specifically, this changed the language about how we talked about rights, how we talked about freedoms. This moved us further away from the British style of convention really creating constitutional law to having that strong document, that foundational statement of who we are as a people. This is something that's happened in the early part of my own lifetime. So I also find this really interesting because I do think today Canadians often talk about who we are as a people, and that is because we repatriated our Constitution. When I was younger and growing up, Canada was very rarely defined by who we are. We were almost exclusively defined by who we weren't. So I do think that this is one of those long-lasting, really significant moments within Canadian history that will continue to have impacts for the future generations on how we define ourselves, talk about ourselves, and see ourselves as a country. Anyway, I would love to go deep on all of these. There's a semi going past me right now because I'm in the Liberty Village. But I would love to go deeper into any and all of these topics. Shoot in the comments anything that you'd like me to cover. Looking for great ideas to help you enjoy the channel a little bit more. And no matter where you stand on the politics of today, make sure that you are better informed of the context in which we're having the discussions.